sees me clean and righteous and justified in His eyes. And all the sin that I was guilty of, Jesus Christ takes the blame for, and He was already judged in my place. I said it's a spiritual transaction that takes place, and it can only take place by faith in the unseen world when someone comes to God as a sinner, willing to admit their guilt and their need to be forgiven. And this guy was raised a Jehovah's Witness, and so he kind of, not too devout with them, and he's open to me talking to him. But I said, you heard a lot about the gospel, but you never heard anyone actually explain what it was. You heard a lot about Jesus Christ, and this man was Christ-like, but you never heard anyone talk about Jesus Christ. You have to pay very close attention. It's not what you hear, it's what they didn't say. That's why some people are fooled by it. Well, they're fooled by it. Well, they have clean families. Nobody's in jail. Nobody's smoking or drinking. Nobody's in trouble with the law. And that's good. Those things are all moral and fine. And that's the way we ought to live. But Jesus said that some would come to God and say, we are unjust servants because we have done that which was our duty to do. Why do you think you're going to get extra points from God for doing what you ought to do anyway? You ought to live a life without drugs. You ought to live a life and stay out of jail. You ought to live a life that's clean and not give any problems to other people. That's what God expects. That's the minimum you want to do. You don't get any extra points for that. But they think that's living the gospel. That's going to get them into heaven. It's going to get them into hell. And this man died, and for all I know, unless he was saved and nobody knew about it, he died and went to hell, just like any other sinner dies without Jesus Christ, without the righteousness of Christ covering him. But righteousness in the Old Testament is based upon a man's goodness. And to that extent, the Proverbs 12:3, there's something good to be said about it. The root of the righteous shall not be moved. He says, a man shall not be established by wickedness. The way our memories are, we are fairly selective in our memories, or convenient maybe is a better word. We remember the great people of history, especially in church history. A very small minority of people who were truly sold out to God, truly given over to serving Jesus Christ. Great preachers, great singers, great missionaries, great Bible teachers, great Christian soul winners, great personal workers, great prayer warriors in that respect. And but the large, broad majority of Christians, I think, give God second best. They give God less than they ought to give Him. They do less than they ought to do. And they never come to a conviction that I ought to give God more. There's still more that I can give to the service of Christ. But the way history has unfolded, we remember the Fanny Crosbys, and we remember the John Wesleys and the Charles Wesleys, and we remember the Charles Spurgeons and even the John Calvins. We remember great names throughout church history. We remember the Mary and the Marthas and the Lazarus that was raised from the dead. And we remember the great heroes of the faith. The great ones stand out. Their legacy, their reputation lives beyond them. And that should be the desire of every Christian. I want whatever good I have done in my life to outlive me. Dr. Ruckman's got a theory about this. And that is the best... I ran this idea by my brother-in-law, who's a very secular-minded man. He was a UC Berkeley graduate and a very liberal thinker. He's a high school teacher out in Etiwanda. Etiwanda. But I ran this by him, and he said, man, you ought to develop that in a whole philosophy. I didn't tell him that. I borrowed it from somebody else. But Dr. Ruckman's observation is this, that the best cooks in the world are men. At least the ones that get the most recognition. The best painters and artists in the world are men. The most famous songwriters and poets are men. The best The the chemists that design perfumes for women are men. I mean, the most famous women's dress designers and clothing designers and shoe designers are men. Even in fields that women have an instinct for, men seem to dominate. And the politics of the world are decided upon mostly by men. And the governments of the world are run by men. The militaries are ordered and commanded mainly by men. And men, he says that's because women can do something that men cannot do. And women are the bearers of life. Women bring forth new life. And men can't do that. He says, so men are trying to create something and give life to it that will outlive them, that will live beyond them, something their name will be attached to generations from now. Does that follow? Everybody follow? Because women are uniquely made by God to do something that man can't do. So men are trying to create life. They're trying to create something that will live beyond them and have their name identified with it and go down in history as something that they did, something they left, something they imparted to the world and gave to the world that outlives them. And I think he's right about that. But Psalm 102 verse 28 says, the children of thy servants shall continue, and their seed shall be established before thee. The actions of a righteous man ought to outlive him, as well as a righteous woman. The good deeds, the actions, the conduct, the behavior, the testimony, the witness, the kindness, the charity, the sweetness, the joy, the friendliness, the politeness, the good manners, the love, the respect of righteous people, men and women, ought to outlive them, so that your children will have all of those things in their minds and be able to recall them one day when you're gone. They'll be able to tell those things, same things to their children and their grandchildren when that day comes, and have fond memories of you, and not have to say, well, your great-grandpa was John Wilkes Booth. He tried to kill Abraham Lincoln. We don't want anyone telling. We don't want to tell him about that. No, you want something good to be said of you and your legacy. It's something we can take away from verse 3. Verse 4 says, "A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband." This woman stands in contrast to the perverse and the rebellious, immoral woman back in chapters 6 and 7 when we were in those chapters. This is a lady who's described in Proverbs 31. In 31 verse 10, he says, "Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her." Ruth was a great type of the church, and Ruth was said to be a virtuous woman in Ruth 3 verses 10 and 11. And even saved people who compose the church are said to be a crown in the New Testament. 1 Thessalonians 2:19 says, "For what is our hope, or joy, or crown of rejoicing? Are not even ye in the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ at his coming? For ye are our joy, our glory, and our joy." So the believer is said to be a crown to adorn the head of the believer's head, the church's head, Jesus Christ. And if a wife is doing what she ought to do, being helpmeet to her husband, Genesis 2:18, then she will help him to be what he ought to be. God told the man, Genesis 1:26, "Thou shalt have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the fowls of the air, and over the beasts of the field, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." He is to subdue it and have dominion over it. She will treat him, and he will feel as a king in his own life if she is fulfilling what she ought to do as his helpmeet. The verse describes or indicates a number of things about a wife. First of all, she'll be an adornment to her husband. He'll look much better out in public when she's with him rather than him all by himself. And secondly, she will be displayed publicly for praise. And I'm not embarrassed to thank God publicly for my wife and to describe the ways in which she looks after our household and manages our affairs under our roof, and the kids and their needs, and all of the other things that come up in home. Also, she'll be well cared for and protected. This much a husband owes to his wife, and he ought to be not afraid and not hesitant to praise her publicly. That's what Proverbs 31 also says. Her husband praiseth her in the gates when he speaketh with the elders of the city. Also in verse 4 it says, but she that maketh ashamed is as rottenness in his bones. Who wants that? It's like a rotten woman is like arthritis. Who wants it? Nobody. And that's the woman who lets the dishes pile up. That's the woman who doesn't put any effort into preparing some hot food once in a while. Those are things women are great at. And the woman who says, no, I'm not going to do it. Let everyone get their own, There's TV dinners in the freezer. Well, there's some negligence taking place. There's a woman who spends more time watching television during the day than looking after the household. There's a woman who's always gossiping on the phone more often than she needs to be, talking with her friends, talking with her sisters, talking with her neighbors, talking about everything under the sun, gossiping about what's happening down the street, gossiping about somebody else in the neighborhood. And it can be a tempting thing to dwell and indulge yourself in other people's business. But and I realize men can be guilty of this too, but certain stereotypes seem to